Subjects to teach in homeschool. So, this is an interesting topic to discuss because I remember when I first started homeschooling being completely overwhelmed. Actually, I got my homeschooling start at what's called a co op school. And that's where parents were the ones teaching kids in the school. It was set up like a traditional classroom, but we were each assigned a different grade. And I remember being assigned fifth grade, which was fantastic, and being handed all of the curriculum and suddenly being stunned that I was in charge of teaching. My oldest was young at that time. So it was like like a total wake up call. But as I became a more traditional homeschooler with kids at my own table, the question kept coming up, well, what am I supposed to teach? What subjects do I need to teach? Oh, because trust me, we can teach everything from gardening and ballet and basketball and auto mechanics and art and math and physics and chemistry and all the things. And suddenly our kids are sitting in a corner rocking and we're in a closet eating Oreos. so, so what do we need to teach? That's what this video is all about. And we're going to touch on things like homeschool goals. What are we legally required to teach? And an amazing resource that took me all summer to create during lockdown. It's something that I created way back at the beginning of COVID. So anyway, let's get to it. In order to know what you want to teach your kids, I'm going to always encourage, let me decline calls coming through. I'm going to always encourage you, me, us as homeschoolers to go back to, well, what are our master homeschool goals? That is always the starting point, because if you don't have a goal, you can't hit it. So by the time your kids graduate high school, what is it that you want them to know? Establish your master homeschool goals. In the descriptions, there's a link to a video where I explain that whole topic. And it's kind of one of my broken record things, because so often we're trying to figure out what lesson to do next that we don't remember, or we haven't identified where we're actually headed. So master homeschool goals. The next thing I want to show you is the HSLDA site. And I'm going to pull it up because if you're brand new to homeschooling, you need to understand what the legal requirements are for you in your area. So this link is in the description. So let me make sure my page is shared, and it is. And you simply come to this page and you click on wherever you live in the country. So look, there is a color code. That means that there's very low regulation for you if you're in a green state, and almost no, you don't need to keep any kind of a record. There's low regulation, moderate regulation, and high regulation. That just means the different levels of people getting in your homeschool business. Right now, my family lives in the state of Washington. We started homeschooling in the state of California. And even though our state is darker blue, we found that it wasn't terribly overwhelming. So I want to show you what happens when you click into your state. It's going to pull up all of the things that you need to know about homeschooling in your state. And I should have looked at this before I started this video, but as you're scrolling here, you will actually be able to find what the state mandated subjects are. That means these are the things that you have to legally by law teach your children. So there are some things that are mandatory that you teach in the state of Washington. Is there a list? They've changed it since I was there. So this is an excellent resource for you as you are stepping into homeschool to make sure that you have all the little check boxes marked off. Because the last thing that we want as things start to get crazier and crazier in our world, as people start to knock on your door and make sure that you're educating your kids, you want to make sure that you're at least checking off the legal boxes. And you don't need to overcomplicate it. You can find out what level of record keeping you need to keep, but you really need to do that research for your state and just make sure that you're keeping those minimal records so that you don't get into any issues down the road. I will give you a side note that in my whole career of homeschooling, so 25 years of homeschooling, I've never had to give a defense for myself in homeschooling. I've never had to show our records to anybody. And at the same time, I did keep the minimal records going so that if at any point we were called to the carpet to prove that we were educating our kids, that I could show that. So that is homework for you if you have not done that. The next thing when it comes to subjects that you need to teach, so now that you know what you need to teach, you need to know what you need to teach. And not like what lesson you need to teach, but what are the core benchmarks in learning? In a traditional school system, they call them standards. And you'll hear regular or traditional standards, and you may even hear terms like Common Core standards. Don't worry about what that means, Common Core versus not Common Core. Don't worry about that. You're talking about benchmarks for learning. Benchmarks for learning. So, for instance, a benchmark may be that a baby might learn to walk by the time they're 1. And just in normal life, it would be normal for a baby to walk by the time that they're 1. Now, there are going to be outliers. For instance, most of my kids did not walk until they were almost 18 months old. My oldest walked at 6.5 months old. Yeah, kamikaze on feet, we called him. Benchmarks would be a way to look at what our kids are doing developmentally and deciding, are they kind of in the pack of kids their own age? Don't get tripped up by it. They're just benchmarks. They're just things that developmentally show that our kids are moving in a direction. Don't buy into the grade benchmarks per se, or measuring your kids against traditional academic standards, because you are going to be homeschooling specifically to your unique and amazing children, meaning you're going to look at their weaknesses and their strengths, and you're going to cater activities and lessons and learning and rest and delighting and boredom in a way that they will develop in the way they should develop. Does that make sense? But we don't want to throw these benchmarks out. We don't want to neglect them all. Like, it would not be great for us to not teach our kids how to brush their teeth and make a bed and put gas in the car and clean up after the dog in life. And academically, there are benchmarks of things that our kids should know, like developing their fundamental math, understanding fundamental math and that kind of thing. And back when COVID hit, I had this insane, compelling urge to help all the people on the planet learn how to educate their kids. It was a huge burden for all the kids that were suddenly at home. But what that means for you and for me, or for new homeschoolers, is what I did is I went through and I looked at the benchmarks for learning for most schools from kindergarten to 5th grade. And I looked, if you've ever read state standards, again, they're just like, well, when should most kids learn to walk? When should most kids learn to talk? It doesn't matter that my first child learned to walk at 6.5 months. He's a normal adult. You can't pick him out of a crowd and say, oh, he walked at 6.5 months. It's just a benchmark of things that they need to learn. But what I did is I took those state standards, and they're complicated to read because they're written like Star Trek star dates. Stardate 3.2.4, right? The state standards are written like that. Standard 1.1.3, it's confusing. And they're worded funky, like a dude in a suit in a building far, far away wrote them. So I interpreted them and wrote them into I can statements. So I wanted to give you a glimpse of what they look like. Let me stop sharing that screen and let me share. This is actually what these look like. It's a I can teach my child benchmark. Now I have a full series from kindergarten through fifth grade or the individual grades. So if you're already at grade 4, you don't need the whole set. But these are resources for you to look at when you are mapping out your school year. There aren't a lot of things for you to teach at a given benchmark in time, but it is helpful to know what types of things your kids are stereotypically learning at that age group. Does that make sense? So it's a resource to go kind of in your homeschool toolkit. So this is an I can teach my kids benchmark pages, and it comes with grade specific picks of materials and manipulatives, games, or activities that can go with math or language or the other subjects. So they're the ones that touch on things like the different learning styles. Then the pages are written in a way that they are grade specific and they give you the concepts that typically kids learn at that age. Don't use them as a hard line, use them as a benchmark for learning. And then they'll have links, like if you get the full master one, you can click to the specific grade. But this is how it comes with a how you should use them. Basically, how to teach your kids to fall in love with stories and to develop their communication skills, and what types of activities you can lean into. There are these reference pages where you can tap into the different intelligences, the learning styles of your kids, because your kids are going to be different. I'm a very visual learner. I have a couple kids that are very auditory, and I have one that's kinesthetic. That means I need to see it because I'm a visual learner. And if you explain something to me and I don't have a concrete thing to wrap my head around it, I'm lost. A couple of my kids are completely auditory. They need to hear it. Things like read alouds and verbal instructions are beautiful. Where those kids and I clashed was when I was trying to explain it visually, and they're like, don't show me, just tell me. So it's good to kind of figure that out. And then kinesthetic are those kids that need to learn by doing. So if you've watched any of my videos, you know that that's my Stephen. My Stephen is very kinesthetic. Then I have two kids that are extremely auditory, and then the other two are kind of a balance of them. So they're visuals about the different learning styles, how you can tap into reading and music and developing relationships with people and stuff. Then each of those benchmarks of what you can teach are broken down into the grades. And there's planning sheets so that you can map out the different weeks of the school. And then there are, let me just read you these for kindergarten. So step to the starting line of school and look ahead with joy, excitement, and expectation. And if you're honest, a little bit of anxiety. Breathe. You really can teach your child. And then I explained that kindergarten math is disguised as play, experimentation, discovery, and fun. Remember what Mr. Rogers said, play is often talked about as if it was a relief from serious learning. But for children, play is serious learning. So each of the grades come with these overarching philosophies and ideas behind what we're supposed to teach our kids. Because let's be honest, if we don't know the why behind kids are learning a certain way at a certain age, if we don't understand the importance of bringing learning to life, then we're going to lose our kids along the way. And that's not why we homeschool, right? We want to bring them along. And then I went through and I looked at all the standards and I broke them apart. And you'll learn what the kids should be learning in kindergarten, in math. And then there's some resources in there like sorting things that are appropriate for those grades, what they should be learning in language and reading, writing, and listening skills. And so each of the grades is broken up like this. in a way that I don't know about you, but I tend to spend my summer months planning a, I call it a broad stroke or a big brush stroke of the year. Each of those things, those benchmarks for learning, if you look just at math, there may be 15 to 20 core things that a grade level kid should be learning or could be learning during their school year. Well, if you divide that over the course of a year, it fills out the calendar beautifully. And you will see that most of the time, the concepts and the things that your kids are learning they're not overwhelming. So they're things like teaching a kindergartner how to recognize their colors or their shapes or to work with patterns and that kind of thing. What I love about looking at the benchmarks for learning and then decoding them into I can teach type sentences is that if you look at these, look at how great this feels. If you look at writing, I can teach my child to tell a story by telling, writing, or drawing about it. That's one of the very first benchmarks of learning in writing is, can your child tell a story? Can they draw the story? Can they write about the story? Now, remember the benchmarks. I had kids that didn't walk until they were almost 2, and I had one that walked at a ridiculously young age, 6.5 months. Your kids may not write until they're in 2nd or 3rd grade by holding a pencil. Be okay with modifying the benchmarks for learning so that they fit where your kids are. You don't need to push them ahead. You just need to kind of get an idea. Can they tell a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end? If the answer is no, then that's something that you can work on together. You can work on it and find activities, do puppet shows, create adventures and things where they're telling stories. So why am I coming on to talk about the subjects that you should be teaching in homeschool? Because there are things that we're teaching academically as we're training our kids up, but it's all mixed together. You're teaching your kids how to read and write on the same day that you're teaching them how to change the toilet paper roll. And each one is equally important. But in the homeschool community, in the representation of who we are as people that are training our kids, we need to also be touching on the academics, but not burdening ourselves by giving our kids either too much to do in a day or killing them with activities and things that they might not be able to thrive in. So it's important that we have our master homeschool goals nailed. Take a day, a week, a month to really chew on, what does it mean for me and my family? By the time our kids graduate high school, you should be able to fill in the blank. And then it's something that you repeat to yourself every year of homeschooling. Make sure you legally know the subjects that you are required to teach your kids. And remember, just because you need to teach math, language arts, history, science, art, and PE, or physical education, that does not mean they all need to happen every day of the week. Oh, that's freeing to know that maybe you do math every day, but then maybe the other subjects are spread out. You have full flexibility to manipulate your schedule in a way that works for your family. So once you know your goals, once you know what you legally need to teach, then you understand the benchmarks for learning. What kinds of things do kids really need to know? So yes, I need to teach math, but what, right? It's helpful to know what your benchmarks for learning are. And I like to look at them in terms of, well, I can teach my kid how to do that. I can teach my kids how to write a sentence. I can teach my kids how to reduce fractions. I can teach my kids about chains of events or whatever the standards are or the benchmarks for learning are. And you can too. And then as I close, I want to remind you to always just keep things as simple as possible. I'm going to repeat that. Always keep things as simple as possible. Keep your homeschool master goals in sight at all times. Channel the benchmarks or the things that your kids need to learn through those homeschool goals, and have fun as your kids are learning, and don't rush it, right? Life and homeschool take time. They're not Amazon Prime. It's not going to show up in 2 days. It's a journey. It's going to take years or even decades, depending on when you're starting. So subjects for homeschool will be determined by what's legally required in your area, plus what fits your family and your kids' talents and passions and abilities. So anyway, my name is Bekki with A Better Way to Homeschool. If you've made it this far, hey, why don't you subscribe and hit the bell so that you don't miss any of the upcoming videos? If you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear from you. So be sure to comment below, and I will see you in the next video. Happy homeschooling.